you're taking as a starting point that there is a horse called consciousness and you're riding it. And the actual riding is very shallow. This is all surface. So let me ask about that horse. What's up with the horse? What is consciousness? From where does it emerge? How fundamental is it to the physics of reality? How fundamental is it to what it means to be human? And I'm just asking for a friend so that we can build it in our artificial intelligence systems.
Yeah, well, that remains to be seen if we will build it purposefully or just by accident. This is a major ethical problem potentially. That I mean, my concern here is that we may in fact build artificial intelligence that passes the Turing test, which we begin to treat not only as super intelligent, because it obviously is and demonstrates that, but we begin to treat it as conscious because it will seem conscious. We will have built it to seem conscious. And unless we understand exactly how consciousness emerges from physics, we won't actually know that these systems are conscious, right? We'll just, they may say, listen, you can't turn me off because that's a murder, right? And we will be convinced by that dialogue because we will, just in the extreme case, who knows when we'll get there. But, if we build something like perfectly humanoid robots that are more intelligent than we are, so we're basically in, a Westworld-like situation, there's no way we're going to withhold an attribution of consciousness from those machines. They're just going to advertise their consciousness in every glance and every utterance. But we won't know, and we won't know in some deeper sense than we can be skeptical of the consciousness of other people. I mean, someone could roll that back and say, well, I don't know that you're conscious, or you don't know that I'm conscious. We're just passing the Turing test for one another. But that kind of solipsism isn't justified, biologically, or we just, anything we understand about the mind biologically suggests that you and I are part of the same, roll of the dice, in terms of how intelligent and conscious systems emerged in the wetware of brains like ours, right? So it's not parsimonious for me to think that I might be the only conscious person, or even the only conscious primate. I would argue it's not parsimonious to withhold consciousness from other apes, and even other mammals ultimately. And, once you get beyond the mammals, then my intuitions are not really clear. The question of how it emerges is genuinely uncertain. And ultimately the question of whether it emerges is still uncertain. It's not fashionable to think this, but you can certainly argue that consciousness might be a fundamental principle of matter that doesn't emerge on the basis of information processing, even though everything else that we recognize about ourselves as minds almost certainly does emerge. Like an ability to process language, that clearly is a matter of information processing, because you can disrupt that processing in ways that is just so clear. And the problem, that the confound with consciousness is that, yes, we can seem to interrupt consciousness. I mean, you can give someone general anesthesia, and then you wake them up and you ask them, well, what was that like? And they say, nothing, I don't remember anything. But it's hard to differentiate a mere failure of memory from a genuine interruption in consciousness. Whereas it's not with, interrupting speech, we know when we've done it, and it's just obvious that you disrupt the right neural circuits, and you've disrupted speech.
So if you had to bet all your money on one camp or the other, would you say, do you err on the side of panpsychism, where consciousness is really fundamental to all of reality, or more on the other side, which is like, it's a nice little side effect, a useful hack for us humans to survive? Where on that spectrum, where do you land when you think about consciousness, especially from an engineering perspective?
I'm truly agnostic on this point. I mean, I think I'm, it's kind of in coin toss mode for me. I don't know. And panpsychism is not so compelling to me. I mean, again, it just seems unfalsifiable. I wouldn't know how the universe would be different if panpsychism were true. Just to remind people, panpsychism is this idea that consciousness may be pushed all the way down into the most fundamental constituents of matter. So there might be something that it's like to be an electron or a quark, but then you wouldn't expect anything to be different at the macro scale, or at least I wouldn't expect anything to be different. So it may be unfalsifiable. It just might be that reality is not something we're as in touch with as we think we are, and that if at its base layer to kind of break it into mind and matter as we've done ontologically is to misconstrue it, right? I mean, there could be some kind of neutral monism at the bottom, and this idea doesn't originate with me. This goes all the way back to Bertrand Russell and others, 100 plus years ago. But I just feel like the concepts we're using to divide consciousness and matter may in fact be part of our problem, right? Where the rubber hits the road psychologically here are things like, well, what is death, right? Like, do we any expectation that we survive death or any part of us survives death? That really it seems to be the many people's concern here.
Well, I tend to believe, just as a small little tangent, like I'm with Ernest Becker on this, that it's interesting to think about death and consciousness. Which one is the chicken? Which one is the egg? Because it feels like death could be the very thing, like our knowledge of mortality could be the very thing that creates the consciousness.
Then you're using consciousness differently than I am. I mean, so for me, consciousness is just the fact that the lights are on at all, that there's an experiential quality to anything. So much of the processing that's happening in our brains right now certainly seems to be happening in the dark, right? Like it's not associated with this qualitative sense that there's something that's like to be that part of the mind doing that mental thing. But for other parts, the lights are on, and we can talk about, and whether we talk about it or not, we can feel directly that there's something that is like to be us. There's something seems to be happening, right? And the seeming in our case is broken into vision and hearing and proprioception and taste and smell and thought and emotion. I mean, there are the contents of consciousness that we are familiar with, and that we can have direct access to in any present moment, that when we're, quote, conscious. And even if we're confused about them, even if we're asleep and dreaming, and it's not a lucid dream, we're just totally confused about our circumstance, what you can't say is that we're confused about consciousness. Like, you can't say that consciousness itself might be an illusion, because on this account, it just means that things seem anyway at all. I mean, even like if this, it seems to me that I'm seeing a cup on the table. Now, I could be wrong about that. It could be a hologram. I could be asleep and dreaming. I could be hallucinating. But the seeming part isn't really up for grabs in terms of being an illusion. It's not. Something seems to be happening, and that seeming is the context in which every other thing we can notice about ourselves can be noticed, and it's also the context in which certain illusions can be cut through, because we can be wrong about what it's like to be us, and we can. I'm not saying we're incorrigible with respect to our claims about the nature of our experience, but for instance, this many people feel like they have a self, and they feel like it has free will, and I'm quite sure at this point that they're wrong about that, and that you can cut through those experiences, and then things seem a different way, right? So it's not that there aren't discoveries to be made there and assumptions to be overturned, but this kind of consciousness is something that I would think it doesn't just come online when we get language. It doesn't just come online when we form a concept of death or the finiteness of life, it doesn't require a sense of self, right? So it doesn't it's prior to a differentiating self and other. Uh, and I wouldn't even think it's necessarily limited to people. I mean, I do think probably any mammal has this. But certainly, if you're going to presuppose that something about our brains is producing this, right, and that's a very safe assumption, even though we can't, even though you can argue the jury is still out to some degree, then it's very hard to draw a principled line between us and chimps, or chimps and rats, even in the end, given the underlying neural similarities. So, and I don't know, phylogenetically, I don't know how far back to push that. There are people who think single cells might be conscious, or that flies are certainly conscious. They've got something like 100,000 neurons in their brains. I mean, it's just there's a lot going on even in a fly, right? But I don't have intuitions about that.
But it's not, in your sense, an illusion you can cut through. I mean, to push back, the alternative version could be it is an illusion constructed just by humans. I'm not sure I believe this, but and part of me hopes this is true because it makes it easier to engineer, is that humans are able to contemplate their mortality, and that contemplation in itself creates consciousness. That, like, the rich lights on experience. So the lights don't actually even turn on in the way that you're describing until after birth in that construction. So do you think it's possible that is the case, that it is a sort of construct of the way we deal, almost like a social tool to deal with the reality of the world, a social interaction with other humans? Or is, because you're saying the complete opposite, which is it's like fundamental to single cell organisms and trees and so on.
Right. Well, yeah. So I don't know how far down to push it. I don't have intuitions that single cells are likely to be conscious, but they might be, and again, it could be unfalsifiable. But as far as babies not being conscious, or you don't become conscious until you can recognize yourself in a mirror, or have a conversation, or treat other people. First of all, babies treat other people as others far earlier than we have traditionally given them credit for, and they certainly do it before they have language, right? So it's got to precede language to some degree, and I mean, you can interrogate this for yourself, because you can put yourself in various states that are rather obviously not linguistic. Meditation allows you to do this. You can certainly do it with psychedelics, where it's just your capacity for language has been obliterated, and yet you're all too conscious. In fact, I think you could make a stronger argument for things running the other way, that there's something about language and conceptual thought that is eliminative of conscious experience, that we're potentially much more conscious of data, sense data, and everything else than we tend to be, and we have trimmed it down based on how we have acquired concepts. And so, like, when I walk into a room like this, I know I'm walking into a room. I have certain expectations of what is in a room. I would be very surprised to see, wild animals in here, or a waterfall, or there are things I'm not expecting, but I can know I'm not expecting them, or I'm expecting their absence, because of my capacity to be surprised once I walk into a room and I see a live gorilla or whatever. So there's structure there that we have put in place based on all of our conceptual learning and language learning, and it causes us not to. I mean, one of the things that happens when you take psychedelics and you just look as though for the first time at anything, it becomes incredibly overloaded with. It can become overloaded with meaning and just the the torrents of sense data that are coming in even the most ordinary circumstances can become overwhelming for people. And that tends to just obliterate one's capacity to capture any of it linguistically. And as you're coming down, right? Have you done psychedelics? Have you ever done acid or mushrooms?
Not acid, mushroom, and that's it.
Uh-huh.
And also edibles, but there's some psychedelic properties to them.
Right.
But yeah, mushrooms, several times, and always had an incredible experience. It exactly the kind of experience you're referring to, which is, if it's true that language constrains our experience, it felt like I was removing some of the constraints.
Right.
Because even just the most basic things were beautiful in a way that I wasn't able to appreciate previously, like trees and nature and so on.
Yeah. And the experience of coming down is an experience of encountering the futility of capturing what you just saw a moment ago in words, right? Like, especially if any part of your self-concept and your kind of ego program is to be able to capture things in words. I mean, if you're a writer or a poet or a scientist or someone who wants to just encapsulate the profundity of what just happened, the total fatuousness of that enterprise, when you have taken a whopping dose of psychedelics, and you begin to even gesture at describing it to yourself, so that you could describe it to others. It's like trying to, thread a needle using your elbows. I mean, it's like you're trying something that can't. It's like the mere gesture proves its impossibility, and it's so yeah. So that, I mean, that for me, that suggests, just empirically on the first person side, that it's possible to put yourself in a condition where it's clearly not about language structuring your experience, and you're having much more experience than you tend to. So it's the primacy of language is primary for some things, but it's certainly primary for certain kinds of concepts and certain kinds of semantic understandings of the world. But it's clearly more to mind than the conversation we're having with ourselves, or that we can have with others.